Disclaimer: the views and opinions expressed in this here video are by no means to be taken as objective. They are just that, mere opinions. Some people may agree with me, some may not, and others will likely fall somewhere in between. Having disagreements and providing criticism can be healthy, so feel free to comment below and let me know if you agreed or disagreed with parts of the video. But please, whatever you do, keep it civil. Thank you, and with that out of the way, let's get on with the video. Most of us have had that one game that defined our entire childhood. A landmark title that we not only have fond memories of, but it can often play a large role in our understanding of what art can be. Growing up, I couldn't understand why video games weren't held in as high esteem as other forms of art out there, like books, movies, music, paintings, etc. As many of the ones I played had some kind of impact on me. They could leave me feeling content, gratified, confused, frustrated, even exhausted. Many of the same sensations that I picked up from other mediums out there. Yet, for whatever reason, it wasn't treated with the same respect as those other formats. Now, luckily, somewhere over the course of the last 20 years or more, it seems the world changed its stance on this and began viewing video games on the same pedestal as those other mediums. But that wasn't always the case. And the reason why I bring this up is because growing up in an era where there was a kinda stigma against them and they were looked down upon, treated more as a mindless kid toy which didn't have much value, all it ended up achieving was making me even more curious as to why they were regarded differently. Thus, I spent a large portion of my childhood with that question in my mind. There were many games I played from a young age that helped build my understanding as to what made them things to be embraced, rather than dismissed as merely juvenile pastimes. We're talking titles like Super Mario 64, Perfect Dark, Silent Hill, and then we have Metal Gear Solid from 1998, which might be the defining game from my childhood. Well, that and Resident Evil 2. But as much as I love Resident Evil 2, between them, Metal Gear Solid is the one that resonated with me the most, and played the biggest role in helping me come to that realization as to why games are a form of art. I'm disclosing this information now so everybody understands that even though I have a history with this video game, as well as a large amount of nostalgia for it, I have reached a point in my life where I can also happily criticize it too. People generally have a hard time viewing things from a neutral perspective, allowing their biases to reflect within their opinions. But it's entirely possible to love something and also recognize that it may have a lot of flaws too. I am, however, confident that I won't let my history with this game cloud my thoughts in this video. This brings us to our next subject, Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes, a remake of the original Metal Gear Solid, which released in 2004. When I first heard there was going to be a remake for the 1998 game, just like many other fans out there, my underpants catapulted across the room and broke the nearest window. But there was a slight twist too. It was set to release on the Nintendo GameCube, not the PlayStation 2 like Metal Gear Solid 2 had done previously. Realizing this, I did what any other kid would do in this situation. which was to save up all of my pocket money, find odd jobs to do for my grandparents, and eventually build up enough cash so that I could go out and buy the console, plus a copy of the remake itself. As soon as I had both in my clutches and made it home that very same day, I set the GameCube up, popped in the disc, and, like many others out there, was utterly disappointed with what followed. Something about the Twin Snakes just didn't vibe with me, and I was never able to understand what it was exactly that felt so disjointed about my first go-around. It's been a long time since I last gave it a whirl, and I think it's important to figure out what it was that was preventing me from enjoying it as much as the original, which is why we're here today, so I can delve deeper into the experience and discover what caused me and many other fans of the franchise to dislike it to begin with, but also to be as fair to the game as possible and to highlight positive aspects that the title does do well. It might be that I can find a whole new appreciation for it, now that I've grown up and find it easier to articulate my feelings into words. Is it a misunderstood gem? Does it improve upon the original? Will I ever recover my underpants that got catapulted outside the window all those years ago? This is a Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes analysis. Before we hop straight into the comparisons though, let's find out who exactly was behind this thing. Announced back in 2003 by Nintendo of America, Silicon Knights took the reins for the remake, apparently running into some of the people over at Konami and striking up a conversation with them during a convention, which led to talks for a potential collaboration to create a remake for the Nintendo GameCube system. Japanese filmmaker I'm gonna butcher that name. Japanese filmmaker Ryuhei Kitamura would go on to direct many of the game's cinematics, reportedly handpicked by Kojima because of Kitamura's first and second feature film, versus a zombie action movie that released in 2000, and Alive, a science fiction film based on a manga by the same name, both of which really struck a chord with Kojima, who saw promise in bringing him in, likely because of his knack for capturing stylish, high-octane action. After the project was underway, Hideo Kojima was said to have made regular visits to overlook the progress and lend guidance for the Silicon Knights crew, while the team at Konami called the shots and approved any changes along the way. Don Toledo, the character modeling artist, said the following: "We at Silicon Knights generally did the grunt work, while the team in Japan did the meat of the assets. We generally modified their assets to enhance visual quality and clean up and optimize code." Ted Traver, the technical advisor for the project, and also one of the people behind the script adjustments, described the relationship as follows: "Konami had made it very clear earlier on that we at Silicon Knights were creating the VCR to play their movie." Silicon Knights were signed by Nintendo in the year 2000 to exclusively make games for Nintendo consoles, the first of which was Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem, a psychological horror adventure something type game that ended up being a commercial failure, selling less than 500,000 copies despite the glowing reviews it received at the time, and still does to this very day. Before entering into a contract with Nintendo, they only had 4 games to their name, one of their most successful titles being Blood Omen: Legacy of Kain, praised at the time for its cinematics and voice work. When putting in research for this video, I was surprised to find that many of the voice actors from the Metal Gear franchise took on roles in Eternal Darkness, including the likes of Jennifer Hale.
You can fight like a Krogan, run like a leopard, but you'll never be better than Commander Shepard. I should go.
Cam Clark.
Dear brother, look at you working here at Master Miller's. What is this place? Taco Town? Tacos are us?
Kim May Guest.
Creel's forces crippled our satellite uplinks. We think his main research facility is somewhere on or near this island.
Careful, don't make it too easy for us.
Can it, Walker?
Paul Lighting.
Snake. Snake. Snake!
Greg Eagles.
Pumpkins? Why'd it have to be pumpkins?
Michael Bell.
So those are the levels that we're talking about. Okay, I just creak. You hear that creak? That wasn't me. Just want everybody to know that. I am not Pinocchio. I don't need to be oiled. It's the chair. And I love it. I love the smell of the chair. I love the creak of the chair, because this is a director's chair, and I be the director. Okay.
Al Bowen. Neil Ross.
I just want to say one thing. God bless America.
Meet the women who shared in his passion as he searched for true love. And relive Biff's happiest moment, as in 1973 he realized his lifelong romantic dream by marrying his high school sweetheart, Lorraine Baines McFly.
Third time's a charm.
As well as David Hayter himself, albeit a relatively smaller role.
What drives you? What are your dreams?
Well, you know, I'd have to say my dream project.
Let your dreams drive you. Oh, a message of hope to today's young people from David Hayter.
I never actually said that.
But it's fair to say everybody and their grandparents seemed to be in Eternal Darkness. Then there were a few actors that had not yet been part of any Metal Gear project, but went on to later voice act in some of the titles, like Paula Tiso, Phil Proctor,
Probably best known for the voice of Howard on the Rugrats. And we're here to wish WTIU a very happy 50th birthday. Isn't that right, Howard?
That's right. And me too.
I'm not a ventriloquist.
and Richard Doyle.
Perhaps when we next meet, you will have learned a little humility.
The latter of which would soon move on to Metal Gear Solid 3, and there could be even more I'm not yet aware of. Let's just say there's an insane amount of crossover between Eternal Darkness and Metal Gear. Did you like my Metal Gear impression there? Well, I thought it was pretty good. Even so, some of the cast from the original Metal Gear Solid clearly already had some experience working under Silicon Knights. And a lot of this can also be credited to David Hayter, who gave up half his pay in order to convince Konami to bring back the cast from the original 1998 Metal Gear Solid. Yeah, you heard me correctly. David has always come across as a team player from the various interviews I've read and projects he's been part of. And so for him to sacrifice a huge portion of his income to not only satisfy the fans, but as a way to honor the game that came before, is something worth noting. It shows that he is extremely passionate about the franchise, and I, like everybody else I'm sure, would like to give the man a massive hug. Well, maybe not Hideo Kojima, but I can assure you the rest of us would like to. What in blazes is wrong with you anyway? How can you not enjoy David Hayter cuddles, Kojima? No! Instead, he'd prefer to get them from his side piece, Kiefer Sunderland. Considering we had a recognizable studio and a talented group of actors that already had history working alongside them, you would think this would be the recipe for success, right? I mean, what could possibly go wrong?
That's the proof of your incompetence right there.
Okay, now that we've got all the boring stuff out of the way, and don't for 1 second think I haven't noticed that most of you have fallen asleep watching this video. That's right, I'm talking to you. We can finally move on to the actual analysis. For those watching, you're probably wondering why it's important to establish the history leading up to the game's creation. And to that I say, I think it's worth establishing this framework now because, well, because I said so. That's why. I'm going somewhere with this. Just give it a chance, let it breathe, and I'll take you to the promised lands, I swear. Despite Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem being a financial failure, this didn't perturb Nintendo from giving the green light to what would become Silicon Knight's next project, and also their last for Nintendo. I've put a lot of thought into what might be the most productive way to go about this, and I don't think there is any one correct answer. So I will take this opportunity to introduce a gimmick I will be rolling with throughout the review. A little game I like to call Yay or Nay. Where I plan to dish out points for every good thing the Twin Snakes does well. And points for those undesirable elements of the game that sour the experience. I would like to make it clear now that I won't be adding points willy-nilly. So if I nitpick something and don't add it to the tally, it's because I didn't deem it detrimental enough to the core experience to do so. I'll only be tallying them for the parts that, from my perspective, played a substantial role in shaping my enjoyment of the game. Or, alternatively, the stuff that took away from it. As long as I'm able to convey those ideas or criticisms I might have in a constructive and understandable manner, then how I go about this doesn't necessarily matter. And with that out of the way, let's start from the very beginning, comparing both games point by point, and deconstructing them as we go. And when I say the very beginning, I mean it quite literally. The opening cinematic to kick things off before entering into the main menu is mostly similar to that of the original game. We are introduced to the dilemma, given our mission parameters, and a small briefing to a bunch of characters we'll meet along the way. The only minor differences to speak of is a slightly more action-packed lead-up to Snake disembarking his tiny submarine, as well as a curious moment involving Colonel Campbell, where he makes the ultimate power move by snatching away a disc from this poor sap, who seems positively downtrodden by the whole affair. Yoink! This belongs to me now!
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
The Colonel apparently runs this submarine like it's a high school, and he's the biggest bully on the block. And this poor dude over here effectively just had his lunch money stolen. All in all, there's not much to be said about this particular cutscene outside of that randomly awkward moment between the Colonel and whomever that other dude was. It does about as good of a job as the original game when it comes to setting up the plot, so no points will be awarded or taken away here. The main menu in the Twin Snakes has been revamped, and in my eyes, a welcome addition. While I would say the original is slightly more striking to me personally, I do also embrace changes that contribute in other types of ways. So having a screen representing Solid and Liquid's DNA in a coiled snake-like form, complete with scales and everything, is something I can get on board with. The only small detail that I would have liked to have seen is being able to manipulate the colors and patterns in the background. Something that used to be a staple in the Metal Gear Solid series around this period, and a feature seen in the original 1998 version. But it's not in any way a big enough flaw for me to count as harmful to the experience, especially when you consider a good chunk of people wouldn't have even known about this feature from the original to begin with. Those minor touches do contribute in a small way, however, so there is value in pointing them out whenever I spot them, even if by themselves they don't have a drastic effect. Stacked together though, these minor touches do add up, so even if I don't include them in the final tally, it's worthwhile to address them as they come. From here, we move on to the briefing files, which in comparison to everything else we've seen thus far, have had a major overhaul. Long in the past are the days of static artwork, of people talking, whereas now, we're treated to fully rendered cutscenes. Now I won't lie, I do have quite a soft spot for the way the original game tackled these briefing files, because the artwork by Yoji Shinkawa can only be described as incredibly distinctive. And when you piece this together with the original game's stellar voice acting, these two elements come together in a way that is slightly lost in the remake.
Please, Snake. Save my niece, Meryl.
All right, but I have two conditions.
Name them.
1, no more secrets between us. I want complete disclosure at all times. And 2, I'll only accept orders directly from you, Colonel. No cutoffs involved, okay?
Agreed. That's why I was called. But one thing.
What?
I'm not a colonel anymore. Just a retired old warhorse.
I understand, Colonel.
We'll get to the voice acting later. By the way, I actually tell a lie when I say these sequences from the original are completely static, as I only remember them being that way because while yes, many of them are just a bunch of still images being presented, using the word static to summarize them is a disservice to how these files actually pan out, as there are plenty of close-ups, slow-moving pans, data strewn across the screen revolving around the other characters you'll interact with later. And overall, these briefing files are just dripping with personality, unlike a certain somebody reading off this script. In media like movies, TV shows, and video games, the director is the person framing key elements and details into the camera in order to draw your eye to them, and to indicate they are vital to the story they are trying to tell. The way these briefing scenes play out is an example of that, as we are given close-ups to Snake's face at appropriate times during the dialogue, which brings his character to life and adds subtle doses of personality into the mix. A director shows you exactly what is needed to get their point across and draw you further into the scene. Whereas in the Twin Snakes, you the player are given free rein to interact with the cutscenes as you see fit by moving the camera around. It doesn't add much, but it's a welcome addition nonetheless. Differences like these can be refreshing in remakes if they improve, or at least match what came before. So while I wouldn't go as far as to say this is inherently an improvement, I would consider it a sidestep that another player may prefer over the original. Keep in mind, the 1998 version also allowed players to interact occasionally with the briefing files in similar ways, just not always. This level of interactivity has been extended and even built upon in every file within the Twin Snakes. But for the same reason I've pointed out before, it's difficult to compare the two because on one hand, having the director themselves place focus on important parts of those scenes by, say, zooming in, showing close-ups, panning the camera when appropriate, made them narratively stronger, gave them flavor, if you will. However, video games are meant to be interactive by nature, So by giving the player a way to manipulate these cutscenes to their choosing isn't exactly a bad thing either, even if it does come somewhat at the expense of the developer's vision.
Okay, Snake. Sorry.
Although, you could just as easily make the point that the player gets to choose their own vision. Both approaches have their own benefits, so I don't think one outtrumps the other in any significant way. Although, if there was something to criticize in terms of the briefing files, and the story in general, it would be the liberties taken in regards to Snake as a character. In the original game, he's built up as an anti-hero with a cold exterior, who on occasion would dabble in flirtatious exchanges with his codec crew, but overall displays a demeanor that can only be described as very distant, to the point, and oftentimes quite harsh, only occasionally showing a sense of humor. It makes sense for him to be portrayed this way because he has experienced so many horrors in his time, lost countless friends and comrades, and so this cold exterior he has built around himself is only natural, and as we later find out, is used as a coping method. This becomes all the more apparent when he meets up with Meryl later. It's what makes him so grounded and interesting, and also such a sad character. The way he's presented in this game, however, is less mature and how can I put it? Almost childlike? Turning what was once this.
So someone needs to penetrate, gather intelligence, and report back. Sounds like a spy movie.
Into this.
So, someone needs to penetrate, gather intelligence, and report back. Sounds like a spy movie.
The difference is night and day. The reason Snake said this line in the original game was to mock and show displeasure over the situation, as he's shown to be disgruntled that he's been forced out of retirement against his own will and flung back into combat. It corresponds with the themes that are delved into later regarding war, the effects it has, and how Snake came to be the person that he is. He isn't happy about going back into another conflict, and nor should he be. What with his backstory and all the things he had to bear witness to up until this point. Here, however, it almost sounds like he's looking forward to going back into combat, because I guess it sounds like a cool, fun time, yeah! Completely negating the inner torment a life of war has had on him. It just doesn't work, clashing with the nuance that makes him such a well-written character. Now, you might be saying to yourself that I'm placing far too much weight into this minuscule interaction, and if this were a self-contained incident, I might agree with you that it isn't worth kicking up a fuss over. But unfortunately, this moment doesn't just sit in a vacuum, as there are plenty of stranger things to come as we move forward. For those of you who are craving examples of the types of things I'm currently describing, those details will be provided in due course. Just stick with me on this ride and we'll get there. What I'm trying to say here is that, on its own, it's not a huge deal breaker whatsoever. Yet, when combined together to create a whole, it becomes extremely off-putting, and the lack of those small touches kinda takes away from what makes Snake such an intriguing anti-hero. He isn't quite a John McClane from Die Hard, bantering with practically everybody he speaks to and dishing out large portions of sass at every opportunity.
Do you really think you have a chance against us, Mr. Cowboy?
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
Nor is he a Snake Plissken from Escape from New York, which most people are well aware was a primary influence on Solid Snake's creation. But unlike the Snake we know from Metal Gear Solid, Plissken's personality leaned far closer to what you might expect from, say, a sociopath, having a tendency to be unsympathetic to those around him, and even sometimes outright callous.
Are you from the outside?
Stop shaking.
I can't.
And while Solid Snake might come off that way on the surface, as the narrative continues on, you come to realize there is a reason why he remains as distant as he is.
How could I let Mantis control my mind like that?
If you're gonna doubt yourself, I'll leave you here.
You're right.
Never doubt yourself. Just let it make you stronger. Learn something from it.
How old are you?
Old enough to know what death looks like.
Any family?
No, but I was raised by many people.
Is there anyone you like?
I've never been interested in anyone else's life.
So you are all alone. Just like Mantis said.
Other people just complicate my life. I don't like to get involved.
You're a sad, lonely man.
Come on, let's go.
He's also extremely modest too, shooting down any praise or admiration that is thrown his way by colleagues or whomever else. This humble nature surrounding him comes up multiple times, and on top of that, he displays honorable traits when interacting with other members of Foxhound, allowing them the opportunity to share their thoughts before and after duking it out with them. Deep down, he does care about the rest of the world, and isn't merely seeing his mission to its conclusion because, say, he was given a deadly injection, and the only way to prevent his death was to do what he was told. No, quite the opposite. In fact, later on, Solid Snake finds out he is carrying a killer virus, and for his final act, he attempts to save the world anyway, knowing full well that death was right around the next corner. As I stated before, there's quite a degree of nuance to him that makes him fascinating to behold. He is a combination of a lot of anti-heroes from many popular action movies, but also none of them at the same time. His uniqueness is what makes him stand out. So these changes in the Twin Snakes, as innocent as they might seem on the surface, in the grand scheme of things does reflect poorly on the type of characterization he embodied and story that was being told.
Huh? Oh, sorry. I forgot. Damn!
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
We'll get to that later. Even if we put aside that one scene from later in the game, there's something strangely immature about the way he's depicted in this version, which doesn't gel as smoothly with the dialogue he has throughout. There are so many small moments in these briefing scenes where he comes across like he's only just reached adolescence. Snake? What the hell are you doing, you madman? Hardly befitting of a battle-hardened hero, only serving as a discrepancy insofar as what the writing is trying to say.
I'm starting to get a bad feeling about this.
They'll be sending us some support.
We don't need desk jockeys. We need a nuclear weapons specialist.
Compared to what's actually being shown.
So, someone needs to penetrate, gather intelligence, and report back. Sounds like a spy movie.
As we will come to find out as we dive deeper. There's even an odd moment where the Colonel comes across as a complete buffoon during a later file, where suddenly he stops speaking mid-speech, turns to Naomi because apparently he forgot who the members of Foxhound were, and requires a piece of paper to read the names off.
Vulcan Raven, Giant and Shaman.
You're telling me they left you in charge when you can't even remember basic details of the mission? An individual, let me remind you, that doesn't even have the wherewithal to check that his flies are done up properly. Him? I I don't know about you, but I'm beginning to spot a theme here. It's all very wacky, and leaves me with the impression that these people aren't up to the task of carrying out this operation. Because, well, they come across like a bunch of amateurs, and as a result, I have a harder time being pulled in by the game's setup, subsequently making me unable to relate to them as easily. It's not only strange to see the transformation Snake has gone through between the original and the remake, but the Colonel too. Somebody who was clearly very competent as a leader in one game and made sure to get straight to the point in light of drastic circumstances, pulling no punches to get the job done, into this bumbling, unhinged amateur that shows about as much leadership prowess as a wet sock hanging out on a line. No offense to all you socks out there, by the way. I also feel like the briefing files from the original had a touch of urgency to them, and didn't procrastinate as much when it came to filling Snake in on the mission details, with far less time being spent on quirky comedy hijinks that seem more out of place than anything, especially when you consider the gravity of the situation at hand.
The chief of DARPA and the president of an arms manufacturing company. What business did they have at a nuclear weapons disposal facility?
The truth is that secret exercises were being conducted at the time the terrorist group attacked.
Must be extremely important exercises if those two were directly involved. Were they testing some kind of new advanced weapon?
I'm not privy to that information.
These newfound traits displayed by the characters here just clash with the writing, which was definitely striving to be grounded as far as how each character was portrayed. And when you combine that with the way war is depicted throughout, everything blended together to create a surprisingly effective narrative. Because while sure, there's a lot of over-the-top silliness to be found too, the original managed to balance all of these separate aspects without one thing overshadowing the other. Maybe if they had completely rewritten the Twin Snakes instead of using the same script, there wouldn't be as much friction between what's shown and said. But as it stands currently, I can't help but find it somewhat jarring. There's also an omission that has been made which factors into Snake's hair being highlighted as brown throughout these scenes, even though the impression I got from the 1998 version is that it was envisioned to be blonde. But as you can clearly see here, it's not. Now, I realize this is a point of contention among fans regarding Snake's natural hair color, because in the games leading up to this point, he'd been shown to have brown hair, even though they seem to allude to that not being the case anymore.
Liquid Snake.
Liquid Snake. The man with the same codename as you.
Tell me what you know.
He fought in the Gulf War as a teenager, the youngest person in the SAS. Here's a photo of him. Pretty shocking, huh? His skin tone is different, but otherwise you two are exact duplicates.
I have a twin?
For those people that took the time out to watch through all of these briefing files, a secret tape will play out addressing Snake's hair, and why it's changed from this to this. You could make the argument that the bonus tape only plays the sound of trimmers, meaning he merely cut his hair and didn't do anything else to it. And due to the black and white color scheme of the briefing files in the original, it's kinda hard to pinpoint what shade his hair is meant to be. This kinda had me intrigued though, so I ended up researching deeper into the topic, and as it turns out, some of the initial artwork for Metal Gear Solid 2 represented the character of Iroquois Pliskin, who as many of us already know is Snake in disguise, as having blonde hair. But due to what may have been negative feedback or fear over possible fan backlash, they likely changed it to better suit what the fanbase had come to expect in their imaginations. But what this does suggest is in a game riddled with retcons as it is, Hideo Kojima and other developers working on the 1998 title envisioned Solid Snake to be an exact clone of Liquid Snake, thus switched the lore around to hint towards the idea that Solid Snake may actually be in fact blonde. Does any of this really matter?
Whatever.
Not particularly. It just seemed like a nice bonus bit of lore to give players as a reward for sitting through all of the briefing files. They seem to drop the idea in later games, so even if it did turn out Solid Snake's natural hair color was different, it comes across like they re-retconned the retcon that led us to this predicament to begin with. And now my brain hurts. I do like to imagine that he is ordinarily blonde though, and in the past merely dyed his hair so that he wouldn't stand out as much during sneaking missions. Then when he went into retirement, he had no reason to keep dyeing it as much, giving it the chance to grow and flourish into its natural tint. Or maybe he dyed it blonde to simply go into hiding, it's hard to say. But considering he supposedly carries recessive genes, it would make more sense for him to be this way, since in the world of genetics, generally those that have blonde hair are considered recessive, yet brown hair is dominant. That is, unless what Ocelot was implying when he said the following:
Yes, the inferior one was the winner after all. That's right. Until the very end, Liquid thought he was the inferior one.
Wasn't that Solid Snake had recessive genes, but rather was an inferior clone, which is an entirely different kettle of fish. And meanwhile, Liquid Snake's blondness implies he has recessive traits. Yet those recessive aspects he took from Big Boss could be what made Liquid superior after all.
Oh, nice shot! What's wrong, Snake?
You see, despite the word recessive, when it comes to genes, I'm not sure it automatically implies that a person will be inferior in any way, which is where a lot of this confusion stems from. Granted, this is all just conjecture, and something that becomes even more confusing the further I think about it, because another explanation towards why Liquid Snake's hair color is the way that it is might just as easily be attributed to his history in hotter regions on the globe, potentially contributing to his hair becoming sun-bleached, when normally it might be brown. And if that's the case, it could very well be that Ocelot was in fact suggesting that Solid Snake has recessive genes. There's really no end to this rabbit hole if we want to keep going. But anyway, now that we got that out of the way, I need a fire extinguisher, because my brain is burning. And besides, all of you are wrong anyway, because Solid Snake's hair is clearly black, as you can see here. So sliver on that, you bunch of scrubs. I'll be honest, the only reason why I brought this up is because I'm trying to be as thorough as possible. And from what I've gathered online, it's a hotly debated topic among the fanbase. But the reality is that it doesn't have much of a bearing on anything. My advice? Just follow whatever makes the most sense to you. Blonde, brown, black, redhead? It doesn't make a difference in the grand scheme of things. Just treat it like you would the events leading up to Shadow of the Colossus, for example, where the gaps in the narrative are intentional and there for you to fill in yourself. Because whatever idea you come up with in your head to explain the bond between Mono and Wanda is always going to be far more satisfactory compared to something that is outright told to you. Because it gives you the chance to fill in those blanks with the type of story you'd prefer.
No one is invalidated, but nobody is right.
And in the case of Metal Gear Solid, in regards to this one minor detail, the same logic can be applied. Next up, we have the bonus content, for which a few changes have been made. The VR missions are now a thing of the past, but fortunately, we can still read a plot summary of what transpired in the first two Metal Gears. In place of VR missions, we now have, dog tags? One of many features carried over from Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty, but outside of that, there isn't really anything new that stands out. Once the game has been beaten, you unlock a boss survival mode, which has players taking on each and every boss fight throughout Shadow Moses, one after another in a type of gauntlet. It's not the worst thing ever, but what made the VR missions stand out as much as they did was that they were entirely separate levels and challenges that couldn't be found anywhere in the main game.
Impressive, Snake.
Providing a bonus mode for players to take on foes in settings they would already be familiar with isn't exactly my idea of new content. It's the same content you'd run into while playing through the story, albeit with an arcade-like feel this time around. The mechanics for the bosses are still the same though, so everything will play out the way you would expect. You also don't unlock the bonus gameplay until you finish the game, unlike in the 1998 version where you have plenty of options at your disposal straight off the bat. I have to assume the VR missions were something people enjoyed in the original game too, because a year later they went ahead and sold a whole separate title based on it, otherwise known as Metal Gear Solid VR Missions, or Special Missions if you just so happen to get your hands on a PAL copy. This game was initially included on the Metal Gear Solid Integral set, released only in Japan for a time. I firmly believe the VR missions included in the original 1998 game made for a great tutorial for those that wanted to get to grips with the mechanics and gameplay before tackling the main story for real. Even though the dock area was also set up in some ways as a tutorial too. Even so, only the first portion of the VR missions felt like a way to teach the player basic mechanics, and as you move further into them, they do begin to up the challenge. I personally found a whole lot of value in the bonus content from the original, so the lack of it here can only be described as disappointing. There is even an extra piece of dialogue included in the main game if you did so happen to try them out, which was super unnecessary for them to do, yet also incredibly satisfying, and served as a small reward for your curiosity, for giving the VR missions a whirl before starting a new game. If they had added something different or refreshing outside of dog tags or boss survival mode, I would have been fully on board with those changes. But considering what we are left with, as it is, it just feels kinda empty. I've spent way too much time on the briefing files and portions of the game many players will probably overlook. So without further ado, how about we move on to the gameplay final— oh wait, that's right. Cutscenes, because Metal Gear. The sequence that introduces us to our first gameplay setting is mostly the same. That is until this happens. That was extraordinarily unnecessary of you, Snake. It's not like anybody was watching. Who's he trying to get style points from anyway? Us, the audience? This right here is yet another foreshadowing of things to come, and most of you will already know what I speak of. Again, we'll get to that at a later point, because I want to focus on the fundamentals of the game first, and tackle things in a certain order. Our protagonist finally arrives at the dock, and after a brief codec call— none of these codec calls are ever quick! We are given our first objective. Our goal here is simple: to make it up the elevator and onto the helipad. This section plays out in much the same way as the original, but now with the bonus mechanics introduced in Metal Gear Solid 2. In the Twin Snakes, you can now hang over railings, shimmy behind crevices, drag helpless victims away, hide said enemies in lockers, and play bowling with the guards. Overall, it's an enjoyable area to mess around in, and a solid introduction to the gameplay. Pun absolutely intended, by the way. A small nitpick I have with the Twin Snakes dock area is the cutscene of the elevator coming down with a guard on board, because the gameplay doesn't pause during it, which can quickly lead to Snake getting caught with his pants down around his waist as you wait for the animation to finish. This wasn't a problem in the original game, since the cutscene would momentarily pause the gameplay, giving players a chance to get away before the guards notice anything was amiss. It's a minor thing to bring up, but I can easily see first-timers finding this a tad bit unfair if it did directly contribute to an alert this early in the proceedings. Another aspect worth mentioning is that you can zoom in on the cutscenes and rotate the camera around. Again, just like in MGS2. You are also given the option to zoom past codec calls as well, which is a nice quality of life improvement for people replaying the game who would rather get straight to the action. You'd have to manually tap through each piece of dialogue in the original game, and some of these calls would go on for a while too. And if you're anything like me, this would gradually make my thumb sore, which is something I will need intact for a later sequence. But all things considered, there are quite a few welcome improvements that have been added to the Twin Snakes. Another cool little thing I found is this floating drum, which will move away when your body collides with it. Well played, Twin Snakes. Well played indeed. So I know what you must be thinking. So far, so good. Am I right? Well, not that I wish to be the bearer of bad news, but a fairly big detail is missing here. Can anybody guess what it is? That's correct. Snake's health bar is massive, even though I'm playing on the same difficulty in both games. The reason why this small detail is worth bringing up is because it's pointed out that Snake hasn't been in the field for a while and was pulled out of retirement to undergo this mission. You see, in the original game, this was not only indicated on a number of occasions via the dialogue, but it was also represented in his life bar. The implication being that he is very rusty, which is why over the course of the game, his health bar gradually increases. This was a subtle way of reinforcing that his battle-hardened combat skills and instincts were slowly coming back to him. It might not mean much to the average player, but it was a tiny detail that I appreciated in the 1998 version, because it humanized Snake even further, helping me to relate to his character. Snake may be a clone to a legendary soldier, but that doesn't necessarily make him invulnerable or flawless. In a series so chock full of cutscenes, many of which feature huge exposition dumps on the player, it makes for a nice change of pace to see some parts of the story delivered within the gameplay itself. We get to witness his arc as a retired veteran who has lost some of that spark that made him such a force to be reckoned with, to becoming the legendary soldier that everybody revered him as. And to me, there was something satisfactory about gradually seeing his health bar grow as he got deeper and deeper into his mission. So while this may only be a small component to some, I would argue that it did a fantastic job of grounding Snake as a human being, one that is just as susceptible as the rest of us at losing skills in a particular field given enough time and separation. It also painted him as a major underdog going up against a larger threat, and again, this only makes it easier to root for him. The type of character building seen in Metal Gear Solid was almost unprecedented at the time. It's challenging to come up with any other examples around this period of a protagonist that was this iconic, featuring such in-depth traits, inner struggles, as well as a strong character arc to follow, all whilst having immaculate voice acting to boot. He's the real deal, the personification of good writing and intriguing layers. So to see that somewhat tainted in the Twin Snakes is kinda heartbreaking. It's just obvious that not as much thought was put into him, and although much of the writing is unchanged, the execution and delivery of said writing has been altered for the worse. What is this? But hey, maybe I've got it all wrong. If I increase the difficulty in the Twin Snakes, It might be that they saved this feature for... Oh. Well, shit. As we make our way up the cargo elevator, we're treated to the big face reveal of Snake, showcasing his black hair in all its glory, with a snazzy title card reminding us of what game we're playing, in case you'd already forgotten. These two versions of the cutscene play out in much the same way, with the only real differences being the soundtrack and the over-dramatic zoom-ins of both Liquid and Solid Snake's faces. Less restrained than the original, but nothing too distracting. With that said, I can't say I'm too fond of the newer score used during this particular scene. I think it was going for a fast-paced, action-y type vibe, but it just feels out of place to me. There are elements of techno embedded within parts of the soundtrack, some of which is incredibly dated, and don't quite create an oppressive atmosphere like the original game managed to do. Though that's not to say all of the tracks are like this, as there are quite a few standout pieces scattered throughout. The original 1998 score felt like it was driven primarily on an 80s movie aesthetic, and also fit the type of environment you were in, all of which mesh together in harmony and is a big reason why they're remembered so vividly. Fear not, by the way, because I've got a lot more to say about the music, but for now, let's keep going as we were. Finding ourselves at the heliport, we now have an even bigger play area to mess around in, and can find out the full extent of how the genome soldiers have been improved. Because if you manage to get yourself caught on the dock, the guards in that area aren't able to call for backup, restricting them to taking you out themselves. Now that we've made it to the heliport, however, getting spotted here is far more dangerous, and can lead to what could be considered a pleasant stroll into a complete and total anal gouging. Following in the wake of MGS2, the enemies will surround you in numbers if caught, and despite introducing similar evasion sequences from MGS2, it soon becomes evident that they are far more shallow than the one seen in that game.
Ready? Go!
I hit him. I need some backup here.
Understood. On an additional unit sent to Strut F. Don't allow the enemy to escape.
Move! Clear! Clear!
Return to your positions. Increase security.
Clear! Move. Clear! Move. Clear! Move.
Encounter the enemy requesting backup.
Understood. Sending a backup squad to the stairs leading to B1 on the first floor of Strut E. Don't let the enemy get away.
Move! Clear!
Return to your positions. Increase security.
Clear! Clear! Move! Clear!
Return to your positions. Increase security.
It's the enemy and the elves.
Understood.
I've got him. Send reinforcements.
Clear!
Move.
Clear!
Move.
Clear!
Move.
You suck!
Who is that? It's the enemy and the elves.
It is an improvement over what the 1998 version had to offer though, because in that game it seemed like an endless horde of enemies would spawn just out of frame as long as the alert continued. The way it works in the Twin Snakes is nowhere near as artificial though, and while difficult to evade enemies once you've been spotted, it isn't anywhere near as unfair in the sense that there is a finite number of people who will chase you down, if you manage to knock them out, that is. If, however, you decide to take the lethal route and kill anybody who dares come near you, then the backup units will persist in their attack until they lose track of your position. At least here though, said units will generally spawn on the opposite side of the map to where you are, giving players a brief spell from the action to find a hidey hole somewhere and duck into cover, compared to say spawning just out of view of the camera like in the other version. The backup units also have a distinctive look to them, carrying shields, body armor, and weapons that are exclusive to them, in turn giving players some idea of what to look out for if they do take the aggressive approach. So while this aspect is a lot better in the Twin Snakes, unfortunately the same can't be said in regards to the moment-to-moment stealth gameplay, because these new mechanics in the Twin Snakes don't automatically make it a stronger game. Bringing us to our next topic, the M9 Tranquilizer Pistol, quite possibly the biggest game-breaking stumble the Twin Snakes makes. While the 1998 original had simpler mechanics in place, they came together in harmony to create a balanced experience. You weren't able to do too much, but just enough to have a couple of ways of approaching any given situation. I'll provide an example of the kind of balance I mean. Take this small exchange with the camera sitting at the top of the staircase in the tank hangar. Now, although I have many items I can use to maneuver past it without causing an alarm, each of them also carries with it a risk. Those that are quick on their feet can chance it and sprint straight by. But if it's mistimed even remotely, then Snake will be completely exposed to the camera, and there's almost no chance of recovery if this occurs. Alternatively, if you decided to go with the cardboard box, Snake's speed will decrease, so there's a good chance you'll have to let the camera pan over Snake at least once under these circumstances, all while making sure to remain completely still before then heading down the staircase. But while it can be much safer to avoid the camera this way, that brief moment of waiting means that the guard on the bottom floor will have repositioned in the meantime. And this could lead to him spotting Snake during his descent. Even the chaff grenade, which is usually the go-to for most players, has a degree of endangerment behind it, because although it will take the camera completely out of the equation when used, you now don't have the ability to read the radar, opening Snake up to a possible run-in with the guard downstairs. So it's something that needs to be timed accordingly. These are all viable strategies, but no single one invalidates the other. So even though the Twin Snakes offers a larger array of things you can do, some of those strategies take center stage over others because, let's face it, they're just easier. Why bother figuring out guard patterns and finding brief windows to sneak around them when you can just put them to sleep with the tranquilizer gun? Why hide inside a cardboard box when you can just shoot a tranquilizer dart into the head of somebody that's close by? Why knock on a wall to grab a guard's attention, only to sneak around them as they are distracted when you can just, you guessed it, knock them unconscious with the tranquilizer gun? Why take any kind of strategic risks when you can... I think you get the point. It would be like playing Tetris, but instead of maintaining a fine balance of the types of blocks you are given to work with, they instead released a new version of the game where you had the ability to choose the line-shaped blocks every single time. A straight line all the way to the finish. Now, I know this would be the part where somebody might chime in and say something along the lines of, you don't have to use the tranq pistol, you know. But I've never understood this type of response. Since when did it become my responsibility to take steps to make a game balanced? Because surely that's something the developers ought to have figured out during the development process. Just try and imagine it from the perspective of somebody that hasn't played Metal Gear Solid before, who isn't aware of the pitfalls a weapon like this has to the equilibrium of the game because, well, for all they know, this is meant to be the way that it's played. And as a result, I can imagine this leading to a playthrough where barely any effort is required, therefore making those people feel unsatisfied once all is said and done. This is an unfortunate trait that has been carried over to many of the Metal Gear Solid titles, though I would say the layout of the second game in particular was built to facilitate such an overpowered weapon. What with its tight corridors and claustrophobic interiors, the levels were just designed in a way to make it challenging to get shots off on unsuspecting enemies. The M9 also served a story purpose in showing that Snake and Otacon's organization, Philanthropy, was only interested in saving life, not taking it away. Their aim was to rid the world of devices like Metal Gear, so naturally killing people would have been counterproductive to their goals, hence the introduction of a non-lethal weapon. Not only does it make sense for what they're trying to achieve, but it also feels like a natural progression of Snake as a character after everything he's been through up to that point. A tranquilizer pistol also served somewhat of a purpose in Metal Gear Solid 3, in the sense that the US government didn't want to spark an international incident by taking the lives of Russian soldiers during the Virtuous mission.
Virtual mission?
No, the Virtuous mission.
As a matter of fact, they didn't want to leave any evidence that an American spy was there at all. So while it's definitely a less noble reason why it's used in the third game, it still made some amount of sense. Some people might say the same logic could be applied to Metal Gear Solid 1, but lest we forget that one of the objectives was to neutralize the terrorist threat. And although it was suggested that Snake's best chances were to remain hidden, keeping the terrorists alive wasn't necessarily a priority. Snake was even meant to procure any weapons he could on site, so it's strange that the Genome Soldiers and Foxhound would even have a tranquilizer gun there to begin with. Like, what were they going to do in the event of an oncoming attack? Trank the opposing forces coming in? No, I think not. The harder difficulty modes of MGS3 also rectified these issues somewhat, giving players fewer suppressors and ammo for the pistol, whereas the easier settings made the game too much of a breeze on initial playthroughs. But in regards to the Twin Snakes, they didn't take the opportunity to revamp the layout of the levels in any way. So all you're left with are these huge open areas where you're able to shoot people from a distance without any issues whatsoever. Oh my god, check this out! You can even knock the guards out from inside the vent, taking away any sense of threat before you've even entered the main hangar. It's depressing to think that this was the experience some players had on a first run, including myself. By carrying over the mechanics of MGS2, they could have redesigned the entirety of Shadow Moses to facilitate these new actions Snake has in his arsenal, like hanging, rolling, the use of lockers, you name it. And in doing so, they could have replaced the tranquilizer gun entirely, implementing various obstacles for players to use those new features on, thus finding interesting ways to get around guards that didn't rely on a single weapon. But in the state the game is currently in, it's just a complete waste of new mechanics. I think it's fair to say that most players will instinctively take the route of least resistance, usually unknowingly, because we aren't generally thinking that far ahead. And during my first attempts with MGS3, for instance, although I recognized something was bugging me about the ease in which I got through the game, it took me multiple playthroughs before I figured out what that thing was exactly. Well, that and the thermal goggles. Yeah, that's the real reason why the boss dismantled the trank gun on the rope bridge, broke Big Boss's arm, and then proceeded to throw him into the river below. She was ashamed of him for relying on such a weapon. And Big Boss had it easy too, because check out what the boss did to the last guy who dared to use a tranquilizer pistol in her presence. That's right, you got off lucky, Snake. If only I had known beforehand the sheer ramifications a weapon like the tranquilizer pistol or thermal goggles had on my first playthrough, and the foresight to bump the difficulty settings up a notch to counteract their effects. The experience would have been drastically improved. Because seriously, if you haven't played MGS3, you'll be doing yourself a huge disservice by not playing it on hard mode. It's way more balanced, trust me. I feel like my first experience could have been elevated dramatically and left a larger impression if I had known to take them out of the equation by playing on a higher setting. And the same can be said for the Twin Snakes, because being the dumb, clueless kid that I was at the time, I couldn't foresee the impact the M9 would have on the game until now.
It's poisonous.
Crawling through the vents, we slowly make our way into the tank hangar, but I'd like to briefly mention that viewing things through the vent covers is made a lot smoother in the Twin Snakes. You're able to get a clearer sense of your surroundings, and it isn't quite as clunky as it was in the original, which restricted Snake to only being able to view things straight ahead or at acute angles. This, however, feels so much better. As soon as we enter the hangar, we have to head on down the elevator to find the DARPA chief, requiring us to enter yet another vent. But this time around, there are a few secrets for us to discover. One of them being a very silly Easter egg, as you will soon find out. But for the sake of being as in-depth as possible, it's my goal to address any changes that I do come across, no matter how pervy they may be. When entering the vent in the original game, astute players might come across this part of the vent and decide to observe what was happening below them, leading to their first introduction to Meryl, a character that will have a prominent role in the story as we progress. But interestingly enough, this cutscene could also be completely missed if we were to continue forward without looking down. However, in the Twin Snakes, it will play a cutscene automatically the moment we approach the vent opening. And while I prefer the idea that curious players will be rewarded for their troubles with a brief cutscene, it's such a minuscule gripe that I won't dock the Twin Snakes any points for taking away that opportunity from players. They even do the same for Johnny Sasaki, a reoccurring Easter egg character from the series, or at least somebody that should have remained that way.
Go away! I'm not done yet!
And if you had taken your first left from that very same ventilation shaft where you stumble across Meryl, you would also be treated to another secret cutscene by looking down into the bathroom. These changes are by no means drastic and not important to the overall experience, but there is something to be said about the original giving people the space to find things for themselves and then rewarding them accordingly, compared to the hand-holdy nature of the Twin Snakes that just points them out to you instead. An earlier ventilation shaft will automatically play a cutscene of two guards talking in both versions, where you're given your first indication there's another intruder besides yourself inside the base. The reason why that one makes sense to play without your input is that you've wandered into the middle of a conversation they were already in the middle of. So naturally, Snake is going to be curious as to what they're saying. The same can't be said for somebody who's silently sitting on the shitter or a prisoner quietly working out. The original added another layer on top of this secret too, or I should say it took away layers. Because by leaving the vent back the way you came and then re-entering it again, those paying close attention would soon find out that Meryl is doing different workout routines, eventually leading to her stripping off her clothes entirely. And yes, I did this on both versions of the game, but I swear it was for the sake of this analysis.
Are you sure about that?
I have something wrong with me. The Twin Snakes gives you the option to bypass half the work it takes to find this Easter egg, because now you can simply look away for a few seconds and you'll find that Meryl is changing up her workout. What am I doing with my life? Let's move on, shall we? Afterward, we find the DARPA chief locked away in a cell, bored out of his mind and sitting in silence, probably wondering why a pervert of all people was sent to save him.
What a weirdo.
It is here where we learn of Metal Gear. And during this conversation, a guard shows up to interrupt the proceedings, where we also find out that we were actually playing as Peter Parker all along. Soon after this, however, the DARPA chief dies from a heart attack, something that was likely caused by meeting his favorite comic book hero. And meanwhile, Meryl manages to grab the attention of the guard from before, using this as a chance to make a break for it, letting us out of our cell in the process. Another minor thing that caught my attention that I felt showcases the very different schools of thought these two games have at certain points, which again harkens back to the ventilation shaft complaint that I had, where the Twin Snakes takes away the opportunity for players to find what were initially bonus cutscenes in the original game, instead opting to have them play automatically. But there's also another moment directly after the DARPA chief dies, where you're trapped in his cell briefly safely with nowhere to go. You're essentially stuck here until somebody opens the door from the outside. But I noticed that the Twin Snakes makes a point to change the camera angle to make certain you know that the prison door is now open, in case you were just too dumb to observe your surroundings and spent the rest of your life in this one room. The original just had the door open without needing to point it out to you first, which just goes to show that the game respected the intelligence of the people playing it. Not only that, but this part came across as far more unsettling, since the music in the background stopped completely, and all you are able to hear is a commotion taking place outside. That lack of music for a brief period was very effective in drawing you into what was happening, as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. On the other hand, the Twin Snakes has music playing the second you regain control, which to me at least took something away from this moment. Add on top of that the way the game holds your hand as you figure out what to do next, and what you get is something that doesn't pack as much punch as its 1998 counterpart. What transpires afterwards plays out relatively the same way as the original, and after a tense run-in with Meryl, we enter our first unavoidable alert. We now have the option to take these guys out by non-lethal means, or straight up murdering them if we prefer, unlike in the 1998 version, where there's no way to get past the first 3 genome soldiers that run into the room, without first sending them to an early grave, that is. Believe me, I tried. This occurs before Meryl builds up the nerve to pull the trigger, so you have to take control and kill the first wave that comes through the door. No amount of fists, legs, or stun grenades you let loose will knock them out. They must die, or you can't progress. At first, I kinda liked being given this choice to take them out as you see fit in the Twin Snakes, but I realized that a later cutscene contradicts our decision to knock enemies out instead of killing them, meaning that we have to consider our style of approach non-canon by the time we make it to that very same later scene. What this means is that our gameplay in the original is consistent with some of the revelations nearer the end.
Why did you come here? Well, I'll tell you then. You enjoy all the killing. That's why. What? Are you denying it? Haven't you already killed most of my comrades? That was... I watched your face when you did it. It was filled with the joy of battle. You're wrong. There's a killer inside you.
I can understand if other people feel this is a tad contrived though, since you are given no choice in the matter, but upon further review, isn't that what war is to begin with? Most people don't choose to be a part of it, but situations will arise where you have no other option than to defend yourself, or have to follow the instructions by governments and leaders, even if it doesn't align with your own viewpoints. This was a hugely missed opportunity for the Twin Snakes to make some tweaks to that speech by Liquid, and potentially even reward the player in some way by taking a pacifist approach. But as it is, the addition of non-lethal means has no bearing on the events that play out whatsoever. I have many different thoughts on this, because on one hand, while the 1998 title can be considered kind of an anti-war game, it also seemed self-aware enough that it was able to ride that fine line that avoided contradicting itself, since it recognizes that war is also a necessary evil in some cases. It's an extremely nuanced topic, and Hideo Kojima is aware of this, and it reflects prominently in the writing.
Unfortunately, killing is one of those things that gets easier the more you do it. In a war, all of mankind's worst emotions, worst traits come out. It's easy to forget what a sin is in the middle of a battlefield.
By forcing you into scenarios where you have to murder people, the speech by Liquid Snake in the lead up to the climax made you reflect on your own actions throughout the journey, as manufactured as those sequences might have been. But again, when it comes to war, you aren't always given too many options. It's like that one observation people will make regarding a series like Uncharted, where Nathan Drake murders hundreds of people throughout the franchise, but the story strays away from ever truly addressing it. Though I'm unable to speak for Uncharted 4 as I've not played that one. Video games like Metal Gear Solid, Spec Ops: The Line, The Last of Us recognize the problems that come with neglecting this type of detail, and so incorporated it into their narrative as a means to make us think about the impact something like that has. It recontextualizes everything you had done up until that point. I didn't kill a single person in the Twin Snakes, so why would I need to mull over any of this stuff? As a consequence, I didn't find myself as invested in the themes of war that the game was attempting to address, and if anything, was pulled out of the experience by the inconsistency of what Liquid Snake said and how it didn't align with my actions. The comments he makes at this juncture of the original game managed to leave an impression on me as a kid, and I was no longer able to look at certain genres of video games the same way from that point onward, which is a pretty powerful thing for a video game to accomplish. The Twin Snakes had an opening to build on what the original set out to do, by adding their own spin on things depending on how you handled certain situations, like using the tranquilizer gun on Foxhound members as an example. But it doesn't do anything to address your choices, and in the end, I found that I was unable to relate to it anywhere near to the same degree. You are forced to disregard your own gameplay for the story to make sense, adding a problem that never existed in the original title.
This is horrible.
And look, I like options and being given different tools for me to utilize to help navigate past obstacles, especially in stealth games like Metal Gear Solid, and it can be argued that it's a series that does it better than most. Yet, I find myself contradicting the way I feel about this in the Twin Snakes. There wasn't much thought placed into how the M9 might impact the story, and on top of things, it completely diminishes the challenge presented within the gameplay itself. At least in something like Metal Gear Solid 3, there was some logic in place for how the tranquilizer pistol could impact later stages of the narrative, and on higher difficulties, you can't rely on it anywhere near to the same degree as you can in the Twin Snakes. Even after playing it on hard mode, I didn't reach a point where I was running low on ammunition. I don't mean to dwell on this as much as I am, but it cannot be stressed enough the ripple effect this thing has on just about everything. As soon as the dust has settled and the coast is clear, Meryl decides to split, allowing Snake to get one last moment of depravity in as she makes her escape. Noticing this, she acts accordingly, but Snake goes into full ballerina mode and showcases his gymnastics before the elevator door closes, and she's gone for good. Psycho Mantis comes out, things become slightly awkward and weird for a brief spell, and then we're back to our objectives. But this time around, we have to find out where Kenneth Baker is located. Let's just hope we don't screw things up and get him killed like we did with the DARPA chief. This is a small detail to bring up, but the elevator in the Twin Snakes uses a black loading screen between each floor, whereas the original title managed to cover these transitions up and made switching between floors rather seamless. I don't know how they were able to pull this off in the 1998 version, because I'm fairly confident there is some kind of loading taking place, but whatever trickery they used to hide it away is disguised very well. Naturally, this method will leave players feeling more immersed over the alternative. Heading to the second floor basement, our next goal is to find a bunch of hidden walls and destroy them using C4 charges. Fortunately for us, there was a whole slew of them stashed away in a nearby room. Blasting our way past the bottom left side of the floor we're on, little by little, we're able to find the hidden whereabouts of Kenneth Baker. A nice touch here is that if you blow up the wall leading to the room he's in and stare into it using first-person view before running straight in, you will be treated to a small Easter egg, but no such secret exists in the original game. Entering the room, we find Kenneth strapped to a pillar with wires and explosives. But before we can figure out our next plan of action, Revolver Ocelot enters the fray, taking a shot at Snake, who reacts with the most remarkable backflip I've ever seen. Some words are exchanged, Ocelot gives us a quick showcase of his twirling abilities, and this leads us into our first boss encounter. I enjoyed the ability to view and shoot in first person for the most part, even though it is detrimental to the boss fight against Revolver Ocelot. It only really becomes a problem here and not the rest of the game, so it would have made sense to switch up the boss fight itself so that the first person view didn't make it as easy as it ends up being. The Olga fight in Metal Gear Solid 2 is a prime example of what you can accomplish in this type of boss fight, because the entire thing was built with first-person view in mind. Olga will change the way that she attacks the player depending on what it is they're doing and where they are aiming from, taking advantage of the environment at every opportunity to disorientate you. You could tell a ton of thought was put into it, and every action you made had an equal and opposite reaction by Olga. Something like this could have worked wonders for the encounter with Revolver Ocelot, but instead it just turns into an extremely underwhelming fight, because it's clear that barely any changes were made to facilitate those new mechanics, turning what was once an exhilarating cat and mouse exchange into the following.
I love
It's so easy to get past. Ocelot's AI has no idea how to respond accordingly to what the player is doing, so it doesn't have the same impact as the original fight once had. Because while it wasn't anything groundbreaking, the simplicity of running around over and over to get a shot off at Ocelot while he's reloading his weapon at least left me with the impression that he had some form of self-preservation. Just take a look at this. I dare anybody to stand in one place during the original fight and see how far that gets you. You'd be given extra orifices if you tried, and trust me, I did, when I attempted to replicate the same behavior out of Ocelot. I know you can still technically approach the fight the same way by throwing aside the first-person view, but the chances that anybody did this on their first run are pretty slim. Plus, take a look at this for example. Not only is it easier to chase after Ocelot, but I can quite literally overtake him and punch the guy into submission. And you can cheese your way past the whole fight this way without either party ever letting a shot off. Normally, I would praise a video game for allowing the player to take alternate approaches. Vulcan Raven is a prime example of this, where you had several options at your disposal, but the fight was still orchestrated in such a way that no single solution was so overpowered that it nullified other strategies. Here though, little to no thought was put into any of the other various ways you can engage him, turning what was once a linear yet decently put together boss battle with a simple trick to win into a hodgepodge of various mechanics that weren't well executed at all. The whole point of the remake was to introduce new possibilities and to give players a chance to engage in combat scenarios from another perspective. So you would have thought the developers might have considered changing up the AI to coincide with that, so that they had the ability to counteract these new implementations, much like they did with Olga in MGS2. But no such effort was made, and sadly, this is what we're left with. Defeating Revolver Ocelot, we enter into a cutscene where the cyborg ninja makes his appearance, slicing our adversary's hand off in the process, leading to a rather cartoonish reaction by Ocelot.
What? My hand! Ah!
Compared to what was seen in the original, at least.
What? My hand!
I'll let you decide which one of these was more impactful. The presence of another intruder was alluded to earlier after Snake overhears a couple of guards talking about it from the safety of the ventilation shaft we used to sneak inside the base. Soon after his arrival, all hell breaks loose. Ocelot makes his escape, the ninja cuts down the wires holding Kenneth Baker in place, and we soon find Snake coming to blows with this newfound assailant in the wildest cutscene so far. Something that really kills my connection with Snake is just how over the top he is throughout the game. Even though he was portrayed in the original to be a very skilled, yet down-to-earth soldier. But at no point during that game does he actually do anything that is beyond normal human capabilities. This effectively made it easier for me to relate to him, as well as drew me closer to his dilemma when going up against dangerous situations. Because within the context of the story, I was given reason to think he might not make it out alive. Like, sure, he's considered a legendary warrior by his peers, but the way he's represented on screen and how he talks about himself suggests that behind all the glamorous tales and perceptions surrounding him others might have built in their minds, lies somebody who only made it out of those prior operations by the skin of their teeth.
A legend is nothing but fiction. Someone tells it, someone else remembers, everybody passes it on.
He wasn't shown to be physically stronger or even as quick as many of his foes, but what gets him through these types of scenarios is his deep knowledge of tactics, and this allows him to overcome his enemies by outsmarting them. Take the fight with Ocelot, for example. It's clear both of them are extremely skilled, but Ocelot definitely has the upper hand when it comes to accuracy. So in order for Snake to defeat him, we have to come up with a strategy. And we do this by baiting Ocelot into using up his ammunition until his chamber is empty. And then when he finally takes a brief period to reload his revolver, that is when we strike. Snake may be surrounded by over-the-top, exaggerated characters and situations, yet despite it all, he is shown to be relatively normal in comparison. Made apparent in almost every boss battle throughout the game, we are the underdog going up against a larger threat, which is played up even further in the original by our life bar being so small, reinforcing that Snake is the vulnerable one in these exchanges. Another thing to bear in mind is that Snake is a soldier, so that doesn't inherently mean he would know martial arts and acrobatics. I just struggle to care about his plight as much when he's not only shown to be physically stronger within the gameplay itself, but also to be as overpowered, if not more so, than other characters you meet along the way. When first running into the cyborg ninja in the 1998 title, I was very much intimidated by him and his capabilities. And I had no doubt in my mind that he was more than capable of killing Snake on the spot if he wanted to. I mean, the dude just cut off the arm of arguably one of the most prominent figures in the entire series like it was nothing. Meanwhile, it took us like 5 minutes or longer to drain Ocelot's life bar, even though the cutscene directly afterwards suggests the fight could have gone on even longer. So if anything, it was a stalemate, and we probably owe our lives to the cyborg ninja. And when we do fight him later, he ends up taking the honorable road by going up against Snake without weapons, leaving us with some chance of coming out on top. But right off the bat in the Twin Snakes, as entertaining as the choreography can be, our first meeting ends with a tie, instantly draining away any sense of peril I might have had. And why, you may be asking, am I complaining about realism in a game that has cyborg ninjas, floating mind readers, and giant robots that want nothing more than to stomp you into oblivion? It all relates to context and the goal of how these things are represented. It's a classic example of David versus Goliath, Rocky taking on Apollo. I find it harder to be sucked in by the events of a game if the protagonist is presented to be physically stronger than everybody else he stumbles across, especially when up against a cybernetic organism. Snake is a memorable character because of how the writing focuses on those flaws and limitations he possesses. He is shown to be weaker not only because it makes him more relatable and brings into the equation that much needed human element to balance out the sillier aspects, but there's also that sense of accomplishment we have when working our way from the very bottom, overcoming the odds inch by inch and gradually climbing to the top. The cyborg ninja represents the wackier side of Metal Gear, but there to constantly bring rationality during these parts is Snake. An analogy that comes to mind is the concept of yin and yang. For every fantastical thing that occurs throughout the adventure, an equally grounded element appears in its wake, providing a sense of equilibrium. Can Metal Gear be ludicrous and downright batshit insane sometimes? Absolutely. But it also shows a huge amount of restraint when it needs to, riding a fine line between fantasy and realism, resulting in an experience unlike any other. The Twin Snakes allows the fantastical side of the equation to take complete control, causing friction with the writing that is attempting to delve into serious topics regarding war, nuclear weapons, genes, and many other themes among them. Remember, much of the script has been unchanged between the original and the remake, so by embracing the completely wacky elements and creating a spectacle of the violence that takes place without knowing when to bring it down a notch, it often comes across as kinda tone deaf to what's actually being said in the narrative. This will become apparent during another part of the game, which we will get to. As Kenneth Baker slumps against the nearest wall, we begin to discuss the terrorists' capabilities and find out more regarding the Metal Gear project, on top of being educated about nuclear waste disposal. After a long conversation, he tells us about the person holding the keycards capable of cancelling the launch sequence, who just so happens to be the individual we came in contact with after the DARPA chief's demise. Baker is prepared to give us her codec number, but just as he is about to provide it to us, he suddenly forgets what it was, leading to Snake breaking character in the strangest, most childish way possible, as he begins to pull a tantrum and places the barrel of his pistol, I shit you not, to the head of the person he's attempting to save. Whew, let's recap. The soldier that was sent in to save the world shoves his gun into the head of somebody he's meant to keep alive simply because he forgot a 5-digit number. What the actual fuck? Are you beginning to understand why I may be finding it difficult to get behind this version of Snake yet? What was once this?
Codec.
Yes, she stole it from the guard. If she still has it, you should be able to contact her.
I'm sure she still has it. What frequency was she at?
Oh, yeah. Let me tell you, it's... Oh, sorry. I forgot.
Damn!
Has now become this.
Codec?
Yes, she stole it from the guard. If she still has it, you should be able to contact her.
I'm sure she has it.
What frequency was she at?
Oh, yeah. Let me tell you, it's... Huh? Oh, sorry. I forgot.
Damn! Calm down. What's wrong with you? I just told you I was here to save you.
You're a goddamn lie.
He went from displaying understandable frustration in one game to unhinged psychopathic behavior in another over a guy, let me remind you, forgetting a simple number. This poor man endured interrogation, torture, a broken arm, and being strapped to a wall of explosives for God knows how long. It's unsurprising that he would fail to recall such a thing. What is the matter with you, Snake? Not to be too anal, but in the original title, just before entering the ventilation shaft that leads to the DARPA chief, you can clearly see 3 blips on the radar screen. One for the DARPA chief, another for Meryl, and the final for the guard sitting in the bathroom who is meant to be patrolling the area. But for whatever reason, the Twin Snakes forgot to highlight this third dot. I'm guessing because it was used as a small clue in the 1998 game to suggest that someone was in one of the other rooms, which may have influenced players back in the day to search all the vent openings to find that one blip. But because the Twin Snakes got rid of player agency and automatically forces cutscenes to play the moment you approach these vent openings, they probably didn't think there was any need to keep the third blip on the radar.